Kia ora, welcome to this special episode of Down to Earth Conversations with me, your host, Andy Dixon. Although today, your host is actually going to be Stephen Garton, because earlier this year I featured on Stephen's podcast, Fresh Aesthetic. And Stephen said I can play that episode for you. It was a great conversation, and I thought, rather than re-record something, let's just share that one with you. So that's what we're doing today. Stephen called the episode A Spectrum of Belonging, Embracing Diversity in Our Communities. And we really talked about a whole bunch of things to do with diversity and inclusion and my shifting theological journey and how that's outworked in practice and the ways that I try and live my life as someone who embraces diversity and inclusion. So hope you enjoy it. If you do, make sure you check out Stephen's podcast, Fresh Aesthetic, with a whole bunch of other episodes that are really worth a listen. But without further ado, this is episode 103 of Down to Earth Conversations. Here's Stephen Garton taking over. Coming to that place where I'm actually just really happy with who I am, that stops making other people a threat to that. If my identity is not tied up in what I believe is right and wrong, if I'm part of a community and someone comes in who's real different to that, then I'm actually really intrigued by them. I've learnt that actually being uncomfortable is good. In the past, I would have done everything I could to not be uncomfortable, and I think that's a natural human kind of ambition. But I've also learnt that it's in the places of discomfort that we grow the most. And so by embracing what's uncomfortable, we can become more open. And it might be that we realise actually there's some things I need to let go of here.
Hey, what's up? And welcome to another episode of Fresh Aesthetic, the show where we explore the vastness of the human experience through creativity, authenticity, science, and spirituality. I'm your host, Stephen Garton, and today's episode is my interview with Andy Dixon. Andy describes himself firstly as a husband, a dad, and a son, but he's also a spoken word poet, a writer, a podcaster, a business director, and he has his master's in theology. Andy's podcast is called Down to Earth Conversations, where he talks to ordinary people who are doing good in the world, or as he likes to say, are bringing a bit of heaven down to earth. This conversation is a raw and real look into what it means to be inclusive of minorities and not exclude anyone based on belief. If you enjoy the show, it would mean a lot if you left a 5-star rating on Spotify or a review on Apple Podcasts. Alright, let's get it. I'm really stoked to be here, Andy, and it's kind of surprising to, first of all, meet you now and record a podcast for my podcast in your house.
Well, my parents' house.
Your parents' house, right.
Yeah, my parents' house is a lot quieter than my house because my 3 children are running around at my house. So
yeah, and this is just so fun. It's like if something Kiwi about this, just rocking up to your house and or your parents' house and meeting you for the first time and doing this. But like, let's hear about you, who you are, and what you're all about.
Yeah, cool. So I'm Andy Dixon. I'm 43. I had to think about that. But once you get kind of past 35, you have to start figuring it out.
It's that memory loss.
So yeah, I'm 43. I've got a wife and 3 kids. Got girls who are 12 and 10 and a boy who's 5. So that's keeping us nice and busy with life. I do a whole bunch of things. I'm a podcaster. I'm a children's author. I'm a poet, a spoken word poet. I work for 2 different Anglican churches across a bunch of different roles. And yeah, that's a story in itself. That's a fairly new thing. But I'm really enjoying that. I'm a board chair. I guess I'm explaining a whole lot of things that I do. Who am I? To be honest, I'm someone who loves to create and who loves to encourage. And my favourite thing in the world is seeing something that I do make a difference in someone else's life. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm about, really.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's like a really eclectic mix of things.
Yeah, totally.
And you were saying before we started recording that you're also sports, like you teach
Yes.
or taught on a tertiary level.
Yeah. So my background is actually in sport management and coaching, and I did a sport management coaching degree and then didn't know what to do after that. But my lecturers said, hey, do you want to stay for a year and tutor? And I fell in love with the teaching side of it. So 10 years later, I was still doing it and had become a junior lecturer. So that was great. It was a great season. It gave me lots of skills that I've continued to use, even into working for churches. I was an associate pastor for a number of years. I guess sports is a huge part of life. My dad played for Hawke's Bay at rugby and, was high profile in the club cricket scene and stuff. So, yeah, we had a sports life. I didn't actually – it's amazing I became a musician because the only radio stations I ever remember listening to before I was about 12 were News Talk ZB and Radio Sport. And so, yeah, later on when I was in bands and stuff and people were like, oh, you know this song? And I was like, nope. And they're like, oh, no, you must know this song. Nope. And I mean, I've educated myself a bit now, but yeah, it was all about the sport. So that's kind of a natural thing that I went and did. Interestingly, I actually did 2 years of performing arts school before I went and did the sport stuff. So that was fun as well. But then, decided I needed to do something that would get me a job. So went and did the sport stuff and really enjoyed it. But that was a season, and we've done a few seasons since then. Were
you raised Anglican, or what was your experience growing up in church?
So I grew up Open Brethren, which for those who aren't familiar with it, is a fairly conservative denomination, traditionally no women speaking. If you are in the kind of charismatic Pentecostal world, it would be very different to what I grew up with. There was not much talk about the Holy Spirit other than as one of the persons of God. But so it was a fairly conservative but really good, solid environment. And I think the main thing for me was I had parents who just really loved Jesus and loved to love people. That was a huge thing for me. Like once I left home and ended up going to a church that wasn't Open Brethren, they actually weren't worried. Like a lot of die-hard Brethren families would be like, oh no, you need to go to the local Brethren church. And whereas they actually just were like, oh, we love that you love Jesus and we'll support wherever it is that you are. And so, yeah, landed in a non-denominational charismatic kind of setting for a number of years, spent about 20 years in that kind of environment. And so, yeah, the Anglican thing's only been within the last kind of year and a half. We found our way there because of a random text message from a friend, actually, Jay Ruka, who is he's got a book that some of you will have heard of called Hui Come Home, and is a big voice within New Zealand Christianity around Māori and the way that the church has played a part in colonisation and a whole bunch of other things. And he got asked by the Anglicans up in Taranaki to come and work for them and run a bicultural centre there. After he'd been doing that for a while, he just sent me a random text message that said, hey, bro, have you ever thought about Anglican ordination? I think you'd have a lot to offer down there. And I went, well, I have now. I hadn't. And we didn't really know anything about what Anglican churches were like. And so my wife and I just decided, well, let's just go and swim in that water and see what happens. And our theology had changed a lot over the years. So we were looking for a place that was more open and less dogmatic about what was right and what was wrong in terms of what to believe. And we found a Anglican church that gave us that freedom. So yeah, we planted ourselves there, and then I got shoulder tapped for a role, and then another Anglican church has come and said, hey, can you come and help us out for a few hours a week as we plan some new, more updated, modern stuff. And yeah, I'm having a good time doing all that kind of stuff at the moment. So
you run your own podcast as well. Is there any crossover with going Anglican and starting your podcast, or are they two separate things, or what was the...
Yeah, no, I started the podcast probably 2 years before that, So I started the podcast when I was an associate pastor at a non-denominational, charismatic, Pentecostal kind of church. And the reason I started it is because I'm really big on the fact that I think Jesus called us to make a difference here and now, and that is done by loving people. And I don't think Jesus was unclear about that. I think he rammed that home time and time again. And yet what I was seeing was a lot of Christians who were even praying the Lord's Prayer, may your kingdom come, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and then seem to want to sit back and wait for God to magically do that somehow. I just went, I think it's just way more ordinary than that. It's just doing the ordinary things that make people feel loved. And there's actually people doing that stuff. So what if I just went and talked to them and recorded it, and we put that out there for people to hear, and maybe they'd be encouraged to do stuff too. So that was kind of how it started. And the title of it, Down to Earth Conversations, came from that mix of the idea of the ordinariness of things. And so talking to ordinary people who are doing ordinary things, but that idea of bringing a bit of heaven down to earth, that actually we can create little pockets of heaven for people here. And, it might be that you chuck in your job and go and start a charity, or it might be that you smile at someone as you walk past them. That person might not have had anyone smile at them all day. And those are little things that we can do. So we don't have to do the big things. We can, and I'm glad that some people do. But there's all sorts of small things as well. So that's kind of, where the podcast came from. It's been a place for me to also, as well as interviewing people about things they're doing, it's also been a place for me to sort of explore with people around ways of thinking about life and faith. And, so there's regular themes that are coming up around race and Indigenous peoples, and the way that the church has or generally has not worked for those people because of the way it's been used in colonization and that kind of thing. There's stuff around disability theology, how we view what's good and what's not good, and what we think about people who are disabled. And I've got some great disabled voices on the podcast who just make your brain hurt in a good way. Those kind of themes come out, just real justice kind of themes. The LGBTQAI plus community, where does theology sit around that? How do we love people well? I'm really openly affirming about the rainbow community, but I also understand a lot of people aren't. But how do we love people and not be dicks about it anyway? I think no matter where you sit, like, how do you love people? And I just want people to hear people's stories, because I think so often we argue about what's right and what's wrong. But actually, I don't go to these people and say, hey, you're like a gay pastor. Can you tell me what gives you the theological right to do that? I go, hey, tell me your story. And I hear their heart, and I hear what's been hard for them, and I hear their journey. And so that's kind of where the podcast's at. And the cool thing about the job with the Anglicans is that they hired me knowing that was the sort of stuff I talk about on the podcast. So, if I was doing some of the conversations that I'm having and working for some churches, my job would be on the line. It really would, or I'd have to stop doing it. There are things that I talk about on the podcast and that I challenge people about, including myself, that just aren't conversations that some churches are willing to have. And a bunch of my listeners, that's why they listen to it, because it's conversations they want to be having, but they're not allowed to have at church. So, all of my ones about sexuality and gender and stuff are my most listened to episodes, because that's not a conversation that lots of churches are comfortable having. They're black and white on the issue. They're not open to discussion. So what do you do with your questions? And I just want to ask questions. I want to probe things and pull threads and see where things go. And so working in the Anglican space, I mean, Anglicans certainly aren't perfect, and I'm sure there's been just as many people that have been hurt in Anglican churches as anywhere else. But it's a place that I've managed to find the freedom to think widely about things and ask the questions and not have people go, what the heck are you doing? And like a bunch of the people who actually asked me to come and work for them had been listening to my podcast, and that was part of what drew them to want me to come and work. So that was encouraging. I knew that I wasn't going to get into the job and then get a sit down to talk to about this podcast of mine that, it's pushing the boundaries and stuff. So
that freedom to explore, it's so crucial, because otherwise, I know for myself, I just go insane if I don't have that freedom to just go and see for myself. Because I mean, even if you are going to find, okay, it's not the right way for me to go, I'm not talking about the theology things, I'm talking about in general, you really got to explore it for yourself and come to whatever conclusion you're going to come to.
Was even with my daughter recently, so she's 12, she was at youth group. I was driving her home and she said, "Hey Dad, why is our church not like my school?"
Wow.
And I thought about it and went, in terms of race? And she went, yeah, because my school's like full of Tongans and Filipinos and all sorts, and our church is mostly white.
Wow, that's so perceptive.
And, well, my first proud moment was not even answering the question, but just saying, that is a brilliant question. Keep asking those kind of questions. And so then we had a big discussion about it and, why some of it might be the case. And, a lot of Filipinos are Catholics. So, there's all sorts of reasons why it might be, and not making excuses. There's all sorts of terrible reasons why it might be as well. But for me, that wasn't the point. The point was she's learning that asking questions is okay. And so I was just like so stoked.
What do you think, because I notice about all of these supposedly controversial things, like disability and queer people and Indigenous people, women in church speaking out, like sexuality, like how did that become the controversial stuff? Where did we go wrong that has become the taboo topics? And I know that it's part of this is just culture, right? Like we get TV hands us messages and other things, but as a church kid myself, I know that these are controversial topics in church. Why do you think that is? What do you think is going wrong to be? Church is supposed to be for justice, right? It's supposed to be to help people and love people and be like Jesus. But to me, that is the furthest away you could be if these people in marginalized places aren't being included in the conversation and going, you are welcomed and celebrated here. That's a problem.
Yeah.
A huge problem.
I think for me, what it's come down to is that I grew up, and this isn't like bagging out my parents or my church or anything, it's just the environment I grew up in. The way that I then treated faith in life was to go, what's right and what's wrong? And then I would use my filter of what's right to decide what was loving and what was just. So if it was wrong to be gay, then the loving thing to do is to tell people that it's wrong to be gay and to tell them that they'll go to hell if they don't change. And that was the rationale, was this is right, this is wrong, and therefore let's be loving by telling everyone what's right according to us. And I just don't see it like that now. What I do now is I look at what's loving and what's just, and what I think is right is seen through the filter of what's loving and just. And so I think the church is just so hung up on being right. And I don't think that was something Jesus was really about. He wasn't giving people tests after his sermons to make sure they'd got what was right. He was wanting them to do things that were good and that were loving. When they came and said, what's the greatest commandment? And then it ends up with telling the story about the Good Samaritan. He tells the story of the Good Samaritan and then says to the guy, well, which one of these showed mercy or showed compassion? And he said, which one of these loved his neighbor? And the guy said, the one who did mercy to him or the one who showed compassion on him. And Jesus' words are, go and do the same. Not, yes, you got it right. Well done, tick the box. And yet somehow through the merging of church and power, through the Enlightenment and the modernization of, education and things, we've landed in this place where the church has gone, it's about being right. And yet you've got all these different denominations who all think they're right. And they all think that everyone else is slightly wrong. And some of them are still Christian but slightly wrong. And some of them are so wrong that they're not even Christian. And it's about figuring out who's in and who's out. And if it's about right and wrong, and someone who is living how you think is wrong wants to be part of that environment, they're a threat because they threaten your sense of right and wrong. And they might show other people a way to live wrong. And so you don't want that. If it's about what's loving and just, someone comes along to join your community that lives in a way that's different to how you've seen the world, then you love them and you welcome them and you learn from them. And you let that interaction with that person change the way that you think about life. And it might be that they're living in a way that you go, hey, look, actually, some of what you're doing is really harmful. Your alcohol addiction is not helping you, and how do we work together with you to overcome that? It's not saying that anything goes, but it's about going, well, actually, let's love you and treat you as a person and honor your humanity and then go from there in our relationship, and then go into the disability stuff. It's again this thing of, it's the same as what they were asking Jesus about. They're like, oh, is this guy blind because of his sin or his parents' sin? There was something wrong with someone if they had a disability. And Jesus is like, nope, none of those things. And yet 2,000 years later, we're still having these church healing meetings where they're trying to get people who were born a certain way to be different than that. And, I've had friends being pushed out of their wheelchair in Jesus' name by someone who they've never met before, who didn't even talk to them first, because they had the idea that what was right was physically abled wholeness. And yet when I talked to my friend, he's one of my podcast guests, Manny Cox, and we talked about what's a greater miracle. Is it him being able to stand up and run with legs like an able-bodied person? Or is it that the hearts of his community would shift so much that they would adapt the environment so that he didn't have to stand up and run around like other people? What's a bigger miracle? And I actually think the second one's a bigger miracle, because it's just not happening. So, yeah, I think the church it's become controversial because we've just got stuck in this right and wrong, black and whiteness. And because we've lost touch with the fact that the Bible is in itself a document that changes as it goes. That there are parts of the Bible that argue with other parts of the Bible. And yet we try and homogenize it and make it this is a how to live right document that if you follow it to an exact letter will make you happy. Which, there's so many things I think are wrong with that statement. Is happiness the goal? Is all sorts of things. But I think we've got stuck in this thing where this is the book that has all the answers. And then you come up across, you come against something that it doesn't have the answer for. And you have to manufacture an answer that fits with the way you're already thinking. I could go on. There's so many reasons why we've gone that way. And I think a huge part of it is also just power and control. I don't think many people in church positions would realize that that's a thing, because a lot of them are genuinely loving people who, doing their best. But some of the ways that we keep our theology, or some of the reasons why we choose to not investigate a range of theologies, is because the way that we currently believe is keeping the thing working in the way that we want it to work. And never mind the harm it's causing over here. It's keeping the thing running. It's keeping the thing ticking. And then we find, just more and more ways to support that. So, yeah, I mean, it's a huge mess, to be honest. Yeah. And yet I still find myself called to keep heading back to this thing called the church and finding myself there and helping people ask the questions. And, that's my little pocket that I'm trying to do some good in the world in. And yeah.
Mm. You're a parent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. How many kids have you got?
3.
3 kids, right. And I think an interesting thought here is we've as a country come out of a very punitive system into anti-smacking, and parents these days don't see that as necessary or even why would you hit your kid kind of thing.
Yeah.
I just see that doctrine of hell as it's like the ultimate punitive measure. It's like, okay, you did something wrong, you didn't repent for your wrong, so now you're going to be tortured forever. And you get this hate the sin, love the sinner. And that's where this thing of we're welcoming to you, if we're talking about queer community, we're welcoming to you, but you're not going to serve on any teams. And that's not explicitly stated either. It's no, come in, you're welcome here. But really, eventually, you're going to have to change.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what your thoughts are on the correlations between the punitive nature of the way that theology has worked in a lot of churches and the change of style with parenting and how societies move forward in that way. What are your thoughts on that?
It's definitely, that's been a part of my own journey. I went to a small Christian school that even after the government banned corporal punishment would still use the wooden spoon.
Wow.
Someone had sadistically poker worked a smiley face on it, which, I don't know, just blows my mind. Anyway, my parents smacked, and they are really loving, amazing people, but they were just doing what they were being told was the right Christian thing to do.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And so I think there was a lot of that going on. And, there's people that were held up as exemplars, like Dr. James Dobson, who I look at now and go, why did anybody ever listen to him? Because he is so unbelievably at the forefront of the most controlling right-wing political form of Christianity you can get. But I think there is that thing of, my generation and those coming after going, why would we want to believe in a God that kills his own son because he's angry? What sort of God is that? And that was the message was God was angry with us. So Jesus jumped in the way so that God could take his anger out on him. I'm just that's brutal. And somehow it was being sold to us as children, as love. It's I struggle to get my head around that. There are so many other beautiful metaphors that the Bible uses to talk about God's relationship with the world and what Jesus' life did and his death and resurrection, what all that meant, that actually is about love and isn't about punitive measures. And, you get these people quoting spare the rod, spoil the child from Proverbs, and it's there's 3,000 years ago or more that someone said that, and that was in a society where that was the norm and they didn't know better. And do we need to base our way of parenting on a 3,000-year-old catchphrase? It's not even a book about parenting. It's one phrase that one person wrote down at one stage. And Proverbs are kind of generalizations about life anyway. There's Proverbs that directly contradict each other. There's stuff going, don't reply to a fool according to his folly, that you may be wise or something. But then there's another one going, answer a fool according to his folly, that he may see the light. So do you or don't you?
Yeah, which is it? Come on.
Give me the answer. But the Bible's actually not that much interested in giving you the answer. It's interested in making you think well about life and faith and about asking the questions. And, for all these churches that are freaked out by questions, we follow a Christ who asked more questions than he answered by the hundreds. In the Gospels, he answers something like 7 and asks hundreds of questions. People ask him questions and he just asks more questions. And then he tells parables. And I was taught as a kid they were to make it simple and easy to understand. But Jesus himself says, I say this so that they don't understand and they're going to have to dig a little deeper to figure it out, So ask the questions. And yeah, I think you're right. I think there is like that whole way of parenting connects really well to that power and control God that a lot of churches still hang on to. That God who sends people to hell. Which, I mean, I have to be honest, I don't even think hell's a real place. I think hell is evident enough on the earth. What's happening in Gaza at the moment, that's hell.
Yeah. It's interesting how it all comes back to how you see the Bible, and if you're seeing it as this infallible, like complete book that is perfect and the spoken word of God or whatever, then you're going to have to come up with answers for when it gets tricky or weird, rather than going, oh, they wrote that thousands of years ago, how on earth are we going to apply it to today's life? It doesn't make sense. You're going to have to try and figure out an answer, because that's your kind of way of looking at the Bible. And I just find it often comes tied with like trying to control as well, like control what people think. And if somebody's going off of that main pathway of like, this is the accepted way to think in this place, then they're either disciplined or peer pressured into coming back to the quote unquote correct way of thinking. Yeah. And I don't know, like all I can do for myself is just try and recognize those parts in myself where I want to do the things that I'm trying to critique. And how have you found that? Like, it's quite a journey, but being able to just sit with somebody and listen to them. Like, I'm quite an empathetic person, so it does come fairly naturally to me, but I also do struggle sometimes to just allow people to be themselves and when it's very contradictory to what I think. And so when you come out of these quite strict ways, or places that think in quite strict ways, it can be tempting to just like knee-jerk to the opposite end of the spectrum, but they have the same approach, and you just bring that fundamentalism with you. What's been your experience with that, and how do you sit with people and keep an open mind yourself too, so that you also don't get stuck in a new, the new quote-unquote truth or whatever? Yeah, it's not that you've just been more enlightened now. Yeah, now you've arrived. Those people are the bigots. Yeah, totally. I think a big part of it has been my own journey of coming to understand my own identity. Because I think for a lot of Christians, your identity is so tied up in the community that you're part of that when you lose that, then you've got to recreate that quickly somewhere else. I don't know whether it's just an age thing or just the journey I've been on, but I've really got to a place where I'm just really comfortable with who I am, and I'm really comfortable if people don't like that. And this is from someone who, was desperate for people to like him. I got bullied at high school, and, there was a whole lot of stuff. And I ended up living in a way that was basically about getting people to reject me before they got to know me, because I couldn't handle any more rejection. Because I really, really wanted to be liked. I really wanted to be known. And there's been a whole lot of things that have helped to heal that. But coming to that place where I'm actually just really happy with who I am, that stops making other people a threat to that. If my identity is not tied up in what I believe is right and wrong, if I'm part of a community and someone comes in who's real different to that, then I'm actually really intrigued by them now, because I've learnt that actually being uncomfortable is good. In the past, I would have done everything I could to not be uncomfortable, and I think that's a natural human kind of ambition. But I've also learnt that it's in the places of discomfort that we grow the most. And so by embracing what's uncomfortable, we can grow and we can become
more open and understand even why we believe what we believe. And it might be that we end up believing exactly the same thing more deeply because we've been challenged around it. But it might be that we realise actually there's some things I need to let go of here. Again, just because it's a really easy example, talking about the queer community. When I started working in sport management, I was working in a small department. Over half of them were female, and most of those females were lesbians. And those lesbians were just humans. Their sexuality was actually nothing to do with my relationship with them. It was nothing to do with how good they were at their job. And they were nothing like the church had told me that gay people were like nothing. Nearly all of them wanted lifelong committed relationships. They were just normal people.
Funny that, eh?
I know. But coming from a church.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
Coming from a church where you're told they're not.
Yeah.
And you believe that they're not. You've got two choices at that stage. One is to decide that you must be seeing them wrong. Or one is to go, hey, maybe what I believe is not right. And so, you know, I'm so grateful that I ended up working with all those amazing humans because they set me on a path towards a much more open and loving way of life. I don't know if this is even answering the question.
No, it's so good.
But yeah. I think that that just kind of gives an example of how if we let ourselves be uncomfortable and we see what we can learn from other people, then it's just life is so much more vibrant and expansive. You know, I've learned so much about love from people who aren't part of the church. A real highlight of last year was going to the Awaken conference, which is like the Queer Christian Network of New Zealand conference. And we got to the end of the conference and there's a pura aki, so you could get up and kind of share a little bit about your reflections on the weekend. And my first thought was, well, I'm a straight white male for whom society is designed. I have a voice everywhere. Maybe I'll just sit back and not say anything here.
Right.
And let these people who don't have a voice everywhere have a say. But actually, I ended up going, no, actually, I want to use the fact that I am that person to make a real point here. And so I stood up and said to them, I fit in everywhere. Places are designed for me to belong. And yet I have never felt more included and welcomed than I have in this space this weekend.
Wow.
Because you all know what it's like to be excluded. So you know how to include the hell out of people.
Wow.
You know, and I think that's really powerful, but that only came because I learned to sit with discomfort of, hey, this person doesn't fit with what I think, what I believe, but they're human and they're worth loving and maybe I can learn something. And I think if the church took that kind of position, we would just have such a radically different society. We would have a church that is doing its job of loving our neighbours in a way that is far more comprehensive than what we're doing now. The church does a whole lot of good work in the community, but it's scratching the surface at what we could be doing because we're scared of the other, you know.
I love all of that. Like, it's just everything you're saying about allowing yourself to be uncomfortable and the vibrancy that comes from that, and kind of just, it's like curiosity breaks your whole world open again, and you're like a little child just seeing everything anew for the first time and being curious about it.
Yeah.
When I'm like that and I'm in that heart state, I just find life so much more enjoyable. I find myself so much more open and not getting in my own way. So yeah, I do. I really love your answer that you gave there.
I would say that learning to sit in the uncomfortable spaces is hard.
Oh yeah.
I don't want to gloss over that. It's hard work to fight against all your natural responses, not just natural as a human, but for those of us that grew up in the church, the ones that have been ingrained in us that we didn't even know were there.
Yeah, and there's lots of like codependent tendencies that you can pick up from society as well, but from church is like, I'm okay if you're okay, and if you tell me I'm not okay, then like it's not it's not coming from within yourself, because you're kind of replacing that inner voice that you have with this critic going like, no, that's a sin, it's like, and sometimes it's going to be helpful in certain areas, but a lot of the times it just becomes this nasty inner critic that you end up having a severe dislike for yourself. And I'd just love if you could maybe give some of the tools that have helped you, like getting practical with that, and thinking also, I love what you're talking about with like what people think about you, because like I'm a recovering people pleaser myself, and I'm probably further back in the journey with that than you are. And like, did you experience pushback for these like changes in theology and changes in beliefs? And if so, what are some of the tools that helped you along your journey?
Yeah, I haven't received as much pushback as others that I know, and I'm really grateful for that. Part of that has been having been part of churches where questions were okay. So I didn't ask questions and get shut down. Those churches weren't perfect, and I still got hurt there, but I also found healing there and a bunch of other things. So I was a bit lucky in that respect. But at the same time, it has been a challenging journey of changing my mind about things. I think one of the biggest things for me was recognizing the hold of shame. I was a purity culture kid, and so, there was just a lot of real unhelpful teaching around sexual stuff, kind of really fear-based stuff as well, like the whole thing of, if you have sex, it's like putting two bits of sticky tape together and then pulling them apart and then going and sticking with someone else and pulling that apart, and then eventually you're not as sticky anymore. And so then when you get married, it's not going to be as good and it's like, it's just not accurate for a start. But it also brings a bit of fear. And then also, when you do something that you have been taught is wrong, then you hide it because you don't want other people to think that you're wrong. And so, I discovered pornography when I was about 12 and hid it from everyone. I was fortunate that in my teenage years, smartphones didn't exist. In fact, I was on dial-up. So some of the damage that could have been done was limited. The harmful things that I could have seen, I didn't because there wasn't as much access. But it became something that became really addictive and was this cycle of experiencing something and then feeling deep shame about it and then praying about it, that God would stop me from being dirty and make me clean. And there was all that language around sin that was about dirty and clean. And if you did something wrong, you were dirty. So I had this whole thing of how dirty I was. It was just the most shame-creating environment. I remember the first time I told anyone, and I just felt all this shame kind of fall off. And then I thought I was free, and then I kept looking at stuff, and the shame came back worse.
Right.
And then I didn't, he was asking me how things were going, and I lied to him, like to his face, because I didn't want, but I went through a big journey with that where for a start, I started seeing sin differently. I think, again, sin was very much taught to me as what's right and what's wrong. I've come to see it now as what's healthy and what's not healthy. And, if someone's unhealthy and they go to the doctor, they're not bad because they're unhealthy. They just need some help to get more well. And I think sin for me is that kind of thing. It's things that cause us harm or cause other people harm. So for me, I look at, say, pornography now, and there's people who would argue that it's totally fine and that you can find ethical forms of it. And, there are people that have created a bit of an ethical side of the industry that doesn't use slave labor and all that kind of thing. But just the research shows that it's not conducive to healthy relationships. So I think it's unhealthy. Now, if my kids start looking at it, I'm not going to be disappointed in them because they broke the rules. I'm going to be encouraging them to find more healthy ways to express their sexuality. I think for me, it was that kind of realization around sin that finally got me to the place where I was like, okay, I can stop looking at this stuff now because it's not about right and wrong. it's about healthy and unhealthy, and it's just really not healthy for me, and it's causing all sorts of issues. And the long and the short of it was that I ended up stopping and haven't looked at any for, 16, 17 years now. And there was a sort of a few people who knew. There came a point a bit later down the track where I was like, I kind of want to share about this journey and some of my poetry stuff, not talking about pornography exactly, but this idea of addiction and what it can do to us. And then I thought, if I start sharing poems about that, my parents are going to be like, what addiction? Like, what are you talking about? Because they had no idea. And so I sat my parents down one night and talked to them about my pornography addiction. And that was like the most freeing thing ever. Because if you can talk to your parents about your pornography addiction, you can talk to them about anything, you know? And so that was one microcosm of a journey of dropping shame. And when there's that shame factor, you're trying to balance that out with being liked or being, feeling loved or all of that kind of thing, because you need it to counteract the shame that you're feeling. When you realize you don't need to be feeling that shame and you work through a process to be able to discard that shame, then that helps you to be able to interact with others in a way where you're not actually needing something from them in order to be okay with yourself. And I say that like it's easy. This is a lot of hard work, but that was a huge part of my journey. The other kind of key factor for me around all of it was would have been about 35 when I was first diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and I was pastoring at the time.
Oh, wow.
The range of responses was interesting within the church. I've got a T-shirt now actually that says it's okay to have Jesus and a therapist too. And the funny thing was that in the environment I came from, that was like a controversial statement.
Yeah, crazy.
And now, and I wore it to a thing. I was playing some music at an Anglican clergy conference, and I think it was even the bishop that like looked at my top and was like, "Yeah, we've all got therapists." It's like it's just kind of standard for Anglican clergy to go to therapy. So it's more of that evangelical Pentecostal kind of side of things that is like, no, you should just pray. You just need to pray. Or I started taking medication and people are like, oh, that's fine, but don't you want a miracle? I was like, I take 2 little white pills in the morning and my life has changed dramatically.
Seems like a miracle to me.
Totally.
Yeah.
Like, what sort of miracle are you waiting for?
Yeah.
Because,
it comes back to the ableism thing that you referred to earlier, doesn't it?
Totally. But I had a choice at that moment as a leader in a church whether to be open about what was going on or whether to hide it. And I went, well, the only reason I would hide it is if I felt shame about it. So actually, I'm going to talk about it. And we did a series called Hope When It's Hard and had different people sharing about different ways that life can be hard, where grief comes and, that kind of thing. And I got up and shared about my mental health journey. And I think there were just immediately after the service, 3 different people came up and said, I'm booking an appointment with the doctor.
Wow.
Because they too had been going, actually, I just need to pray more. I'm not a good Christian, and as someone who was pastoring, I'd been not even admitting that it was depression because then there's something wrong with me and my faith and that kind of thing. And again, making that choice to be vulnerable. When you become vulnerable, you're putting yourself out there in a way that I guess reduces the shame factor, because you're no longer hiding behind this wall of shame. You've broken through it and gone, hey, this is me. This is who I am. And I think the more I've just practiced that, whether it's mental health, whether it's the pornography stuff, whether it's just life in general, whether it's going to my kids and saying, hey, look, I yelled at you before and that was not okay. I let my frustration get the best of me. If you can be vulnerable with your kids like that, that vulnerability is so crucial to breaking through all of this stuff. It's in being vulnerable and sharing about these things that other people are empowered. And actually, the crazy thing is we all hide this stuff. And then you talk about it and other people are like, oh yeah, me too. And suddenly you find like A, there's a whole lot of people with mental health issues, or B, there's a whole lot of people asking questions about their faith. And you thought you were the only strange Christian who thought this wasn't quite right and you weren't sure about it. And suddenly you realize there's this entire world of people who are going, what is going on with our churches? I mean, that's a long answer to your question, but I think for me, breaking that shame through vulnerability and practicing that over and over again. And I mean, Not all of you are in a position like I was, where you're pastoring a church and you can stand up in front of a whole congregation and be vulnerable to them. But actually, you don't all need to be, because actually it might just be talking to one friend and going, hey, look, I'm really struggling. And then having that friend go, how can I help you? That empowers you, because suddenly you're like, they love me anyway, even if I'm messed up. If they don't have that response, you know they're not a great friend. So you get a chance to move on. And again, that's the ways of just practicing this uncomfortable stuff, this building stuff up. And I think the other flip side of that, just to add length to my answer, is that like when it comes to like learning to live in a way that you're okay with those uncomfortable spaces. Part of it is the vulnerability and you sharing your vulnerability, and others is just shutting up and listening and going, I'm going to actually listen. Like, okay, so let's talk about race stuff, right? There's a whole lot of stuff going on in our country at the moment, which is just wild. Like, I don't have time to go into all of my political thoughts about what's going on in terms of race stuff in New Zealand. But the best thing that I've ever done as a white New Zealander is keep my mouth shut, other than to ask questions about what's life actually like for people who aren't like me.
Yeah, they're clarifying questions rather than like trying to get your point across.
Totally.
Or just waiting to get your opinion in there.
It's not a debate.
Yeah.
You're not going in there to try and get them to see your perspective. You're also not going to your one Māori friend and expecting them to have all the answers. You're doing your own research.
This is happening in education at the moment because there's a lot more push towards mātauranga Māori, but obviously a lot of people towing the line a bit, and then they're going to that one Māori teacher at school and, well, help me, I'm scared, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, and I've been blessed to have some Māori friends who like do this for a job. So they don't mind me talking to them about it. But there's others who are like, this is the last thing I want to talk about. I have enough pain and awkwardness around this without you adding to it. But yeah, it's listening, it's finding podcasts, finding articles, finding books that can educate you about what life's like for people who are different. You know, I listened recently to a podcast from Australia, over in Australia, called The Change Podcast, and it's hosted by Shane Clifton, who was a theology lecturer, specialises more now in ethics and disability studies. He had an accident and became a quadriplegic, I think, and he's hosting it with his child, who is an adult. The series goes through Jem, the child's transition from male to female, which is not any part of my world. That hasn't been a part of my world. But rather than going to it with a, well, I think this is wrong, what do they think they're doing? I'm not listening to that crap. You know, I went to it going, wow, how vulnerable, they're putting themselves out there. I'm going to listen to this and learn from it. And it was just amazing. Like the stuff that they talked about, you know, Shane as a dad, when it got up to the point where Jem decided to go through surgery. So this was like definitely like a full-on thing. It was quite fascinating to me because having been a black and white Christian, he's no longer that way. His accident, among other things, catapulted him into new ways of looking at theology. But he wasn't asking whether it was right or wrong. He was just really afraid at the ways that it could go wrong. Like he was saying, as a quadriplegic, he's lost his ability to have a sex drive, and he mourns that. And it was his fear that as Jem was going through this, that was a possible side effect of the surgery. Not a huge likelihood, but a possibility. And so hearing a dad concerned in that way, but not a dad going, how could you think of doing this? You know, and a dad just being supportive and loving. And I mean, the whole podcast just blew my mind, because it's just so not a part of anything I've ever had to go through. And they talked about the discrimination that's involved. They talk about a whole lot of things. And it just shapes you, you know, listening to other people's perspectives, even people who you disagree with, helps you to think well about life. And I think the more we can do that, the more we become okay with being uncomfortable. We learn that being uncomfortable brings good things. And so then we can start to embrace that uncomfortableness.
Richard Rohr talks about great love and great suffering being like the biggest spiritual teachers if you allow them to be. And I'm just, as we kind of start to pull this towards the end, how have you had that in your life, and how has that changed who you are? Some sort of great love or great suffering that has like just rerouted your path, so to speak, and, you know, set you on a different course. Has there been a big moment like that, or has it just been like a ongoing series of little things that opened you up?
There have been a few things. There have been those moments of realization that life is not how I've been told it is, like I talked about with my former colleagues. And, you know, those are actually, like, probably before this conversation, I've never really thought about them as moments of suffering. But there is a grief there around, why wasn't I told? You know, there's a moment of, what is going on? So there's been moments like that. One of the key moments for me that really pushed me into stuff was my master's thesis. So I did a theology master's, and I brought up the Good Samaritan before, and part of that was because that was half of my master's thesis, was studying that passage. And once I finished so I studied that one passage for 9 months.
Wow.
My whole thesis was looking at 30 verses for a year and a half. So yeah, people are like, oh, you've got a master's in theology, you must know the whole Bible really well. It's like, well, I know those 30 verses really well. And I guess what it did for me, it put me in a place where I couldn't move forward as a comfortable white middle-class Christian anymore, because what I had studied demanded that I did what I could for those who were different than me. And I think, like, I've heard that preached so many times, where people preach about love and helping people, and then they finish with, so why don't you start with the person next to you? And everything in me screaming, because they are like me. The person next to me is probably quite a lot like me, because we gather in like groups so much. And actually that's not the point. The point is to love those who are different from us, and even those who we've been taught to hate. I mean, I've been listening to a lot of Muslim voices through the Israel-Palestinian conflict and hearing their perspectives on things, because it's different to what pockets of the church would tell me, you know. And so, yeah, that studying that Good Samaritan just really pushed me into a space where I was like, I need to do something different with my life. That's not just about believing right things. And one of the things that I did was we moved to Christchurch for a whole bunch of reasons, but we did it without a job. I came down to live with my parents, with my family. We had 2 kids by then, and I looked for a job down here. And the one that I ended up doing was working for a charity that employed people who have experienced prison to unload shipping containers. And that was one of the best things I ever could have done for changing the course of my life. I talk about how much it ruined me, but it ruined me in a good way. It ruined me for being able to be comfortable. It ruined me for being able to ever say again, they should just got to get off their bums and get a job. You know, there were guys who, they talked to me about how they've been smoking marijuana since they were 7. And before that, they were passively smoking it because it was just always being smoked in their house. So they've never known a drug-free life. And then we're going, wow, they should just give up smoking drugs. It's like,
it's not how addiction works.
No. And it's not how, you know, if you've been grown up taught a certain version of Christianity. Yeah. It's not like, well, you should just give up your Christianity. It's like, well, no, there's a process involved. You know, you wouldn't expect that of that situation. Why would you expect that of drugs? And the idea that these guys were different from me, but not much, and yet we've othered them. We've gone, you guys are so different from me that it is, you're in a different box. Like, I'm human and you're not really. You know, that's how society treats them. We send them to prison to get rehabilitated, and when they come out, we assume that they haven't been, which is just ludicrous. Like, if you ask most people why you would send someone to prison, that would be the answer, for rehabilitation. But we just assume that that doesn't happen in prison. Anyway, but so working with those guys was a huge, huge part of it. And probably the biggest moment in that was because a lot of these guys had done something stupid, done their time, and were looking to try and change their life. It didn't work for all of them. Some of them ended up going back inside. But one of the guys, first of all, I never asked them what they'd been inside for. Because for me, it was about, what are you going to do from now? So it wasn't like, it would have only been for my interest's sake to ask them, hey, what were you inside for? You know? But there was one guy who was working for me, and then it came out in the papers that he was actually awaiting sentencing. He hadn't actually been to prison for this particular crime yet. But the crime that he was accused of and was later found guilty of was assaulting his partner while she was holding their 1-year-old son and punching the baby in the head.
My God.
Yeah. Like, there's no way of making that less brutal than it sounds. I'm getting all like emotional thinking about it. But, you know, I remember saying to people at the time, I desperately hope that that woman and that child have a support network around them. But that's not who God placed in front of me. Or that, if you want to take the religious language out of it, that's not who was in front of me. Who was in front of me is the guy who has done this. And if he is ever going to change, someone needs to love him. Now, I can't do all of that, but I can do my bit. And that was a really significant turning moment for me of going, here's someone who, like, I think is, you really boil it down, I think someone who does that is the scum of the earth. And yet, I also have learnt to understand that there are things in that person's background that have caused them to live as they are. That doesn't mean there's an excuse for them, but there are reasons why it was likely they might end up in that direction. And unless people love them, that's going to continue to their children and to their children's children. And so that was a significant moment of hardship. It wasn't, I mean, I didn't suffer in the way that the victim suffered, but I had this internal suffering of, I don't want to love this guy. I do not want to love him. But someone has to. And that someone can be me right now, simply by standing by him while he works to make his life better. And I wasn't doing any of the social work with him. I was just employing him. But that was helpful. And that was what was needed. And so, yeah, I mean, moments like that have been really significant. The mental health journey has been really significant as well, because I've realized that actually every single one of us has things that make us vulnerable, that make us rely on other people. Nobody's perfect. We're all messed up. And what's the use of pretending we're not? You know, so let's just get on with loving one another.
Yeah, and I just like, I love what you said earlier, like, and this probably would have actually changed me if I had heard these things growing up as well. Is like, one thing you said is like, when your kid asks you a question, you said, you started with, that's an awesome question.
Yeah.
Like, if you say you make a mistake or you have an argument with your wife or whatever, or with your child, it's like, you fix it. You go, but you don't fix it in the sense of like, they just wait it out until you're happy again. You actively go and say, I messed up. I'm sorry. This is what was happening for me.
Yeah.
And this is why that's not okay. It's not okay for me to lash out in that way when my emotions boil over. I need, what I should have done and what I'm going to work on is taking a pause and either removing myself away from the situation or just trying to put some words out there to help you understand what's going on for me in that moment. So yeah, I mean, it's not about perfection, like you said before. It's about turning that on its head and going like, no, here's just some really helpful tools and ways to approach the situation that will just, I think give everybody a better experience overall. And I hope that as we evolve as humans, we can start to make that more of a natural part of who we are as humans and in the human experience. So to pull it all together and to wrap it up, like,
I just love everything you've said, and it's actually really been helping me to like be at peace in my own life as well.
Cool.
What is, like, if you were to summarize the message that you want to share with the world, what would you say that is? What makes you come alive as a person, and then how would you communicate that with others?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it comes back to what I've set up my whole podcast around, which is that we've got a choice in life, whether to live, selfishly, whether to just focus on what makes us feel good, or we can look at how the world is broken and what little things that we can do to help make it better, and figure out how to actually love people really well. We need to start by learning to love ourselves. And I think that has been a huge one for me, is learning to love myself so that I can love others well. But yeah, I mean, I end up thanking my guests at the end for helping to bring a bit of heaven down to earth. And that's something that I think we're all capable of. And I don't care if you're Christian or not, because actually a huge number of my podcast guests aren't. But what they're doing in life is making a difference in someone else's life through action, through thought, through being vulnerable so that other people feel like they can too. There's a huge range of ways we can do it, and it's not all huge. So my encouragement is just to do one new thing that makes life a little bit better for someone else. And hopefully we can all, by doing little things, make the world a better place.
That's awesome, and a fantastic place to end. I feel like you've done that for me today, so yeah, mission accomplished, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me in your house and letting me record here, and it's great to meet you, and it's been awesome.
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And that's it. That was my interview with Andy Dixon. Andy has such a heartfelt and authentic way of seeing people, and it was so refreshing to interview him and hear his perspective on inclusion and bringing good into the world. I particularly enjoyed the sections on ableism and learning to listen to others. For more of Andy's work, make sure to check out his podcast, Down to Earth Conversations, which you can find at downtoearthconversations.com. His spoken word poetry can be found on YouTube, search Andy Dixon. His book, 3 Things to Know, an Etu Tangata Story, can be found at etutangata.nz. This show is intended to bring content that inspires, uplifts, and helps people to live meaningful lives. If you have any feedback about the show or want to make suggestions for guests or things to discuss, please get in touch on our Fresh Aesthetic Instagram page. Alright, I'll see you all on the next one.